Welcome to week 11, right? We're on? Oh my goodness. Hi, I'm Rachel. Mariette was a little under the weather today, so she asked me to fill in for her today. I know. We'll keep her in our prayers. But welcome. We're so happy you guys are all here. Super excited to dive into God's Word. As per usual, we'll have that number up. We're going to try our best to get to the questions at the end of the night and get to them. But let's pray, and then we'll walk up Pastor Tim, okay? God, thank you so much for this opportunity to dive into your word like this, Lord, to go deeper. I pray that your spirit would fill up every heart and mind in this room, God, that you would teach us something new about you, new about your character, God, and just what you've done for us. And so, Lord, I just ask for your covering over tonight. Be with Pastor Tim. Give him a peace, Lord, and anoint every single word he says, Jesus. In your name I pray. Amen.
All right, bear with me because Google just signed me out, so I am signing back in. Technology, it is a blessing, but sometimes it is an error. So, first time that I decided to read the Bible through, and I was a teenager, and I was clipping along. I thought I was doing perfectly fine. I think I was reading in the Jerusalem Bible. And then I hit this, Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And part of me is like, wait, what? And part of me is like, I loved reading science fiction and fantasy, so I was very, yes, finally, something really cool in the Bible. But I'm like, I think I need to find out. Maybe I'm not reading this right, so I looked at what I had available for commentaries, and then I noticed that people are arguing about what this means. So we are going to do the deep dive into the rabbit hole that is Genesis 6, 1 through 4. We're going to try to leave no stone unturned in the period of time that we have. And you will certainly know more about these few verses than you did before. And it came about when Adam, meaning humanity, began to multiply on the face of the Adamah, and daughters were born to or for them. And the sons of Elohim saw the daughters of Adam, that they were tov. And they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. All right, sons of Elohim, they saw that they were tov, and they took. Does this sound a little bit like a pattern we've seen before? Okay. The Adam, meaning the humans, are multiplying on the Adamah, which is what they're supposed to do. This is a fulfillment of Yahweh's blessing and command to be fruitful and multiply. So they're carrying on with the function that they're supposed to do, and daughters were born to them. So in chapters 4 and 5, the focus narratively has been on the sons and the lineages of the sons. But what about the daughters? So let's back up and share what we know so far, what we've learned so far about the daughters. And the story so far on women is they were created in Genesis 1, 26 and 7 as co-imagers to rule and to be blessed, or to mediate blessing, as we find out in page 2 of the Bible. So these are co-imagers, co-rulers in Genesis 1, 26 and 27. And as we learn on page 2, from one human, this one human is made into two from the human's side. The word selah there, rib is an unfortunate translation. It doesn't mean rib. It doesn't mean rib anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. It always means side, like the side of a building, or the side of the ark, or the side of a hill. Rib is, I can tell you why it's become rib, and nobody's trying to fool anybody. It's just how the translation history happened. But think of from one Adam's side, suddenly we have two. And then they become one and one flesh. So this is cool. And the woman is appointed to be the Azer, which is great translation to say helper, but it depends on what you mean by helper. If you mean by helper like a maid, that is not what Azer means. Azer does not mean maid or butler or the help. Azer is usually used of God as our help in time of need. So this is like almost a rescuer. I've used the term first responder, even though they didn't have first responders in the same way back then, because it gives the sense, I think, of what we think of when we think of someone that's really going to help me. If you are in need of surgery as an emergency, the surgeon is your Azer. Does that mean that they are below you or they're somehow you can order them around? No, I hope not. Azer is a elevated or lofty thing. So that's who she was. But the woman is deceived by this shrewd Nachash who persuades her, who is supposed to be the first responder, and through her, the man, to find elevated status and wisdom on their own terms. I know Yahweh Elohim said, or just Elohim said, don't eat from this tree, but that's because he knows the day you eat of it, you're going to really know, you're going to be like Elohim. You're going to know between good and evil. And so this shrewd talking snake they're like, well, most of the snakes we know of don't talk. There's something else going on with this one. He's very shrewd. We want to be shrewd. So they take. The woman violates the boundary. This is very important. There's a boundary that Yahweh Elohim has set. Take of all these, but don't take of this one. Here's the boundary, not to cross. And she crosses it regarding this tree of knowing Tov and Ra. And then the humans, they don't become shrewd, they realize they're nude. And that's a word play in the Hebrew of arum and aram, that's why I'm doing it in English. And they no longer trust each other. They're like ashamed. They're like, well, I got to cover up because now I don't know if I can trust you to each other or trust God. And as it turns out, that's justified, certainly in the woman's eyes, to wonder if she can trust him, because the first thing that happens when God confronts them is the man throws her right under the bus, doesn't he? She catches blame from him. And then finds out, as God begins this series of curses upon the ground and upon the Nachash, and then a lament towards them as to what's going to happen, she finds out how this is going to play out. They're going to have this power struggle, and generally, the Ish, or the male, is going to win the power struggle in general. And we see this played out in the rest of the book of Genesis. Also, she's going to have grief in her conception, which we see played out multiple times in Genesis, where women have difficulty conceiving, and sometimes, many times, in the bearing of children themselves. And we see this play out, including in the very next chapter. So, continuing this whole power play thing, the male, the Ish, names her. Remember, he named all the animals. That's what rulers do. Now they're not co-ruling. He's ruling her. He's giving her a name, and the name is Chava, which is a great name. It's beautiful. I mean, it's like, hey, honey, I have the best name for you. And it's going to be your name. It's going to be can you imagine, guys, if you did this with your wife? I've got a new name for you. We're going to change your license and everything. I picked it out. Here's your new name. You see what I'm saying? It's like, really? No, you're not going to name me. But he does. He names her Chava, which in English is Eve. And then what happens in the very next page, page 4, she takes the credit for making a man, just like Elohim made a man, and this is Cain. But later, after a bunch of grief, she recognizes the birth of Set as a gift from Elohim. So there's grief in the bearing of her first children, Cain and Hevel. So, and there's one thing not in the notes. There's another instance where women show up briefly in the life of Lamech. And Lamech is great, isn't he? Lamech takes 2 wives. He's like, one is good, 2 are even better. And then he uses them as kind of his audience where he can boast about having killed this kid who injured him a little bit, and how God then he just imposes upon God almost a penalty for protecting him. Lamech is great. So here is this lament that God is predicting in page 3 starting to carry out. And with this in mind, we've talked about men for a couple of chapters. Now daughters come to the forefront again. Will there be grief in the bearing of their children in these few verses? I think so. So when the sons of Elohim saw the daughters of Adam, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Who are these sons of Elohim? There are 3 theories that scholars argue about. There's one group that says, well, sometimes sons of God, like Israel, is called the son of God, or David. So this is referring to godly people, maybe from the line of Seth. That's one theory. Others say, well, the rulers of those days, like in Mesopotamia and just the great kings, and they styled themselves as gods, as Elohim, so maybe it's referring to them. And the third is that, oh no, these are spiritual beings that have become corrupt somehow. So those are the 3 theories. I had an opportunity to sit down. I don't know that we actually ate a meal. We were on a cruise ship. It was this conference. This is 23 years ago. I was at this conference that one of the speakers was Dr. Eugene Merrill, who's an eminent Bible scholar. And it was just me, him, and one other person. We were just sitting around this little table. And the other person who was helping organize the conference says, hey, if you got any questions for Dr. Merrill, this is the time. And so, I'm like, yeah, I have a question. What about this whole Genesis 6 thing, the sons of God, the sons of Elohim? I mean, what are they? And I figured I was going to get a very conservative answer. He's a Southern Baptist, longtime teacher at Dallas Theological Seminary, taught at Bob Jones University, teaching now, I think, at Southern Baptist University. This is like an ultra-conservative, not weird man. He was one of the translators in the Old Testament of the New King James Version, one of the translators for the New Living Translation, and one of the translators for the Holman Christian Bible. So I'm not going to get weirdness from him. And this is what he said. He said, the rulers thing I don't think is really a viable option. But between godly people from the line of Seth and spiritual beings, it's 50-50. And I was like, what? You think there's a 50% chance it's the weird thing? Seriously. And I couldn't just leave this alone, so I left him alone. But the last 23 years, I've looked into this further. What is going on here? So those who promote that these are corrupt spiritual beings, note correctly that sons of is idiomatic for belonging to the group of. Such you'll see future books in the Bible where it talks about the sons of the prophets. It means they're prophets. They're part of the prophetic school. Job chapter 1, verse 6 is interesting, where it says, now there was a day when the sons of Elohim came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So clearly talking about spiritual beings in Job chapter 1, verse 6. What caused me, and I've landed here. I've landed in a place where it's like 95%, I think, and I'm open to correction. But I've landed that, this is talking about actual corrupt spiritual beings. And I'll tell you a few reasons why. One of the reasons why is because it fulfills this narrative design pattern of crossing boundaries, which we've already seen and we're going to see again. So the woman, the Isha, she crossed a boundary that was set by God not to take from this certain tree. And she saw that it was good, and she took it, and she ate of it. And the results were terrible. So now we have this situation where this boundary is being crossed, and they're seeing and they're taking something that is forbidden to them, and the results, well, we're going to see what the results were. So this is very similar to this. There is a coming chapter. If you stick with it with me until chapter 11, there's a reversal of this going from the other way. So in this case, spiritual beings have become corrupt, and they want to merge heaven and earth on their own terms. Remember, heaven and earth have been separated since the fall. The Garden of Eden, which was the overlap spot of heaven and earth where God and humans were interacting, they're like, well, we want to recreate something like that, but on our own terms, and we're going to do it by merging with the humans and crossing that boundary. Well, in Genesis chapter 11, we get the similar thing from the human side, is let's build a tower to the heavens. Why? So that they can bring heaven and earth back together, have this place where the spiritual world and the human world can interact again. You see this, they keep trying to cross this boundary. And I think that's exactly what's going on here. I like what Gordon Wenham says in the Word Biblical Commentary that he did on Genesis 1 through 15. One must look behind the specific terms used to discover the reason for the condemnation in this case, why this is bad. The sequence of saw, good, took, parallels most closely the terminology in chapter 3, verse 6, and suggests the sinfulness of the action of the sons of God. When the woman saw and took, she transgressed a boundary set by the Lord. The essence of Adam's sin was to acquiesce in his wife's transgression by eating the fruit she gave him. Here, the fault of the daughters of man lies presumably in their consenting to intercourse with the sons of the gods. It also ought to be borne in mind that the girls' fathers would also have been implicated, since if there was no rape or seduction, their approval to these matches would have been required. The obvious avoidance of any terms suggesting lack of consent makes the girls and their parents culpable. I know, it's strange, isn't it? But there's a reason that the biblical authors are highlighting this. Remember, they don't have to talk about anything. They only talk about things that are very relevant to the narrative that is unfolding, and they choose to talk about this. Why? Well, let's keep reading. And Yahweh said, my Ruach will not dwell with Adam forever, because he is also flesh, and his days will be 120 years. So, after the very first violation of the boundary, this was choosing the word of the Nachash over the word of Yahweh Elohim, the humans were exiled to the east from the garden. Remember, they're still in Eden, but they were exiled to the east. After the second boundary violation, which was murder, Cain is exiled even further east. So this is the third violation, and this one is a big one. The corrupt spiritual rebels are looking to merge with humans, perhaps, so that their offspring, through their offspring, they can act as rulers over both realms. And this time, Yahweh's like, all right, enough. I'm going to put a limit on my animating ruach on these thrice corrupt humans. And his days will be 120 years. Have some thoughts on this, because there are a couple of theories on this. One of them is that, and this is what I was taught, like in Bible college, is that 120 is the upper limit on a person's lifespan. And this, quote unquote, solves the problem of why it seems like people lived so long back then and no longer do, which we talked about last week. That's not how they saw it. They saw these people living 700 or 969 years as, why so short? Because it was so much less than they had been taught that the patriarchs would have lived. But the problem with this 120 years as the upper limit is because when you read the Bible, because there are a number of characters that come after this in the Bible that live longer than 120 years, such as Terah, Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Kohath, Aaron, Jehoiada, Job. I mean, there's a lot of characters that live beyond the 120 years. Another meditation on this, and I think this is the correct one, is he's saying, okay, they've got 120 years, and the clock is ticking until something big is going to happen. Now that we've had this corrupt spiritual beings violating this boundary, and humans, we've got demons and humans mixed together, this is going to end. And it's going to end in 120 years. In other words, their days are numbered. So in 120 years from this moment, something is going to happen to wipe the slate clean. Can anybody guess what that might be? A little something called the Mabul, yes, the flood. So humans are in an eternal death spiral right now, in league with the corrupt spiritual powers. Yahweh can either just let it go on forever by keeping his ruach within them, or hand them over to the death they keep pursuing. And that is the biblical image, if you read it enough, of God's judgment. It's more handing people over to what they're already pursuing. So which of these two things is more merciful? Just to keep this corruption and, vile hatred towards each other and murder and so on, and corruption between the spirit realm and the earthly realm, just keep it going forever, or to put a fuse on it? This is a legitimate question that skeptics have, and I think we should honor it and reckon with it, is what to do with Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. 120 years, we're being prepared for this, that in 120 years from this part of the story, untold multitudes are going to drown in a cosmic flood. So how can a good God sanction, let alone initiate, sudden death on this mass scale? In the biblical worldview, there is just no one-dimensional way to look at this. I know it's tempting just to say, well, they deserved it. But we all deserve it. To the biblical authors, death is by no means good. But it is also not entirely what we would call evil. Death is an unwelcome invader in creation, but it's an invader that nevertheless finds itself caught up in the Creator's redemptive cyclone. Even death cannot overcome the power of Yahweh's deliberate and unrelenting love in the minds of the biblical authors. So a skeptic would probably say at this point, well, that's a nice defense of God, Pastor Tim, but where is the evidence? Where's the evidence that the God who unleashed the flood is a God of compassion and love? I think the evidence comes to us during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius in the backwater province called Judea, on a skull-shaped hill just outside Old Jerusalem, during the day's regularly scheduled execution. Because that's where Yahweh gave his one and only Son, through whom he created the whole cosmos. John says in chapter 1, it's his word made flesh. He sanctioned and even initiated death upon him. And why? Because he loved the world so much that anyone who believes on the one who died on that both good and evil tree would not need to perish, but would instead experience the tree of life forever. That's the evidence. Okay. Verse 4. I know you've been waiting for this one. The Nephilim were in the Eretz in those days. Oh, and also afterward. When the sons of Elohim went into the daughters of Adam, and they bore children for them. These, to explain, these are the Gibborim. You know, the Gibborim. Everybody knows the Gibborim. Who are from ancient time. Ish of the Shem, of the name. Men of the name. Okay. what? Many of our translations, instead of Nephilim, which is a Hebrew word, will supply the English word giants. Many of you have translations that say giants. Perfectly legitimate translation, but it doesn't give the cultural sense of what's going on here. To us, we read this, okay, wait a second. Spiritual beings, you're telling me spiritual beings somehow had sex with human women and giants show up. This is a lot to swallow, Pastor Tim. This is outside of our experience. It's outside of our cultural river. So we're going to be good tourists. Let's go back in time and look through ancient Israelite eyes, shall we? This is not the weirdness to them. There is weirdness in this to them that is shaking them, but it's not in the existence of the Nephilim. Because not just the ancient Israelites, everybody knew about their version of the Nephilim, or these great hero beings that had partial divine origin. Every culture practically had these. You had, in Mesopotamian culture, you had Gilgamesh. In ancient Greece, you had Heracles. Later, the Romans had Romulus and Remus. Their father was Mars, right? So these great founding fathers, these mighty warriors, these powerful demigods, in ancient cultures, these were revered beings. These were almost holy. Some of them had temples and worship centers to these Nephilim or to these demigods. You can think of many cases. Perseus, Theseus, these were great heroes. And what's happening here is, and just to make sure you know that this is what the biblical authors are talking about, it says, you know these guys that you think are just all that because they're demigods? Well, just so you know, yeah, we're talking about them, the Giborim, which means ones who fall, like in battle, the great battle warriors who don't get old on their deathbeds, they fall in battle like Achilles. These are men of the name and men of great reputation. They're ancient heroes associated with one parent who is some god or other. The biblical authors are saying these are Nephilim, the spawn of a foul boundary violation between exiled humans and lesser corrupt spiritual beings. These are not heroes to be revered. These are hybrid, demonic humans that you don't want to honor these things. And what they're doing here is they're totally reframing the deeply revered founding fathers idea in the minds of the ancient people. They're saying this is not how it went down. What you thought is not how it goes. Take your honor and your reverence away from these beings. They don't deserve it. Michael Heiser, who has done so much work on these subjects, he writes, Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is a polemic, meaning it's criticizing. It's a literary and theological effort to undermine the credibility of Mesopotamian gods and other aspects of that culture's worldview. Biblical writers do this frequently. The strategy often involves borrowing lines and motifs from the literature of the target civilization to articulate correct theology about Yahweh and to show contempt for other gods. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4 is a case study in this technique. You see what the biblical authors are doing? They're not introducing the idea of half human, half spiritual beings to these people. Everybody already knows they existed at one time. Some cases they thought they existed even in their time, and they did. And now, Pastor Tim, are you saying that it's not real, that they're just using this as a literary technique? I think it was also very real. But they're reframing in the minds of the listeners what these beings actually meant. So at one time, my focus on this was, how do I prove to my 21st century mind that these beings existed? Where's the archaeology? I know they've found these bigger bones, and, I can go down that rabbit hole, and I did for many years. But when you look at it through the ancient eyes, you see what's trying to be accomplished here. It's not proving to them that these beings existed. That's a given. What it's doing is reframing it. Yahweh is the only one worthy of worship. And these beings that are like national founders and cultural icons, don't bother with them. It was a bad thing. So I want you to notice that this whole section here is a chiasm. So what I mean by chiasm, this is a stepped way of writing that was in use in ancient times, and the Hebrew authors of the Hebrew Bible just took it next level. When you see that verse 1 really corresponds to the last part of verse 4, and then the daughter's part was in bearing children corresponds to a section near the end, and saw that they were Tov, and then the Nephilim corresponds. My Ruach will not dwell with Adam forever, so there's a time limit, and then the time limit being given, his days will be 120 years, those correspond. And the central focus, or the central axis of this chiasm is because he is also flesh. So the central focus here, that he is also flesh, has a double meaning. Humans are going to die, after all, because they are dirt creatures. They're going to return to the dust. But the Nephilim, they're also flesh. The corrupt spiritual beings, those are kind of eternal creatures. But these Nephilim, they're flesh as well. And they will die like men. At least this is the psalmist's meditation on what this means. One of the weirdest psalms in the whole Bible, and I love it, is Psalm 82, where the psalmist is actually meditating on Genesis 6, 1 through 4, but also meditating on Deuteronomy 32:8, where this is brought up again, and we'll discuss this more when we get to Genesis 10. But listen to what the psalmist says. Psalm 82. God, and the word here is Elohim, like the Elohim, takes his position in his council, or his assembly. Baha'el is what it is in Hebrew. El is divine. So he takes his position in the divine assembly. He judges in the midst of the Elohim, spiritual beings. Remember, spiritual Elohim is not the name of God. It's a title for a type of being. Yahweh is the ultimate creator, Elohim, so he's the Elohim. But there are lots of Elohim, spiritual beings. How long will you, he's talking to these little e Elohim, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. You should vindicate the weak and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and destitute. Rescue the weak and needy. Save them from the hand of the wicked. No, this is the Elohim. They don't know, nor do they understand. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, this is first person God here, you are Elohim, and all of you are sons of El Elyon, God Most High. Nevertheless, you will die like Adam. You're going to die like humans. And fall. Maybe this is a play on words of Giborim, ones who fall. Like one of the princes. Arise, God, the Elohim. Judge the earth, for you possess all the nations. What is going on here? This is Genesis 6, 1 through 4, meditation, but also in Deuteronomy 32, where God assigns the different nations according to the number of the sons of El. So the corrupt spiritual beings are the ones who are designated to be they are not corrupt at the time, they become corrupt. These spiritual beings, members of the divine council, are designated to watch over these nations, and at some point they become corrupt. And the psalmist is meditating upon this. So are these human rulers, the biblical authors would say, sure, human rulers have taken on the character of these corrupt spiritual beings who are leading these nations. So is biblical authors talking about corrupt human rulers too? Yes. But are they only talking about corrupt human rulers? No. They're also referring to corrupt spiritual beings. So this blending of human rebels and spiritual beings who are rebels also has created this firestorm of unrest. And Yahweh has set a 120-year timer to quench the unrest. No pun intended. It is pun intended. He's about, and what's going to happen here, what we're going to see starting next week, is a reversal of Genesis 1. It's an actual reversal of creation. So, all right, what's the first audience thinking of this? First thing I think they're going to notice and pay attention to is this whole pattern of seeing and desiring and taking. It seems to be pretty well established by this point as a literary design motif. It should inform the interpretation of future narratives in Scripture, and I hope that's also what we're getting out of it, is this whole design pattern of seeing, desiring, taking, and violating boundaries in that process. It shows up again and again and again and again in biblical narratives, just in the book of Genesis, but also beyond. There is also some kind of spiritual rebellion going on that I know some of you are like, I wish I knew more about the spiritual rebellion. We are not given great detail on how this spiritual rebellion unfolded. We are not told if it is a single instance or happened over multiple instances. We can guess based upon things that show up here and there in the Bible. What is going on with the population of the heavens? Why is there trouble there? And the reason we're not given too much information on it is because it's not our story. It's not our story. We're only told information in as much as that story kind of overlaps with our story. That's somebody else's story. So this is on a need-to-know thing. But I know we're very curious, right? Maybe we need to, this is what the ancients are thinking, maybe, all these action figures we've been buying the kids in Egypt, maybe the trading cards of these demigods are not such a good idea. It's like, not that they had trading cards. So maybe on papyrus or something. Hey, I'll trade you my Imhotep for your Hercules. Plus, I really need a Gilgamesh. I'll give you a Perseus and a Theseus for a Gilgamesh. This is, they're like heroes. Think of us with sports heroes or maybe superheroes, but that really existed. That's how they looked at these Nephilim. And the biblical authors are saying you need to stop looking at them that way. It's not correct. Normal humans were intended to image God and to rule creation on God's behalf, Genesis 1. And these so-called founding heroes are actually demon spawns trying to move in on human territory. They're not good. All right, our reflections today. First of all, the Bible. What in the world have I gotten myself into here? I think a lot of people who do not grow up with this stuff and it's not normalized to them in Sunday school, they'll read this and say, okay, really? What? First, I had to get past the talking snake thing, and now I have to get past this. And I think we should just embrace and reckon that and say, I know, doesn't that make it so cool? At least that's what I do. Notice that the character wearing the snake skin in chapter 3 and the sons of Elohim here in chapter 6 seem to be corrupted by their envy of the human position with Yahweh and role in ruling over the cosmos. You kind of get this undertone of envy from the spiritual beings. They want to disrupt and partake. They're not content with their own delegated rule over their own sphere. And if the spiritual beings attempting to violate this boundary on their own terms outside of Yahweh's redemptive plan, if that's so vile, what about the other way around? What about human attempts to cross the divide to connect with spiritual beings on our own terms and outside Yahweh's redemptive plan? Is that a good idea? This is why witchcraft and sorcery is deemed so vile in the scriptures, because that's a human attempt to do something very similar to what the corrupt spiritual beings were doing here in Genesis chapter 6. Crossing that boundary, violating it on our terms. We see it seems good in our eyes, and we're going to take it because we can connect to the spiritual realm in our way. And that never works out well, at least what the claim of the biblical authors is. Man, we do what seems right in our own eyes, and it's not the way that God has instructed us. It leads to serious, serious problems. So I think that's a meditation that we should sincerely take away from this, is that violating boundaries because it seems good to us should be avoided at all costs. So I know I just hit you guys with tons of stuff, but I'm going to go to our students, and aren't they brave? Can you give it up for our table of students here? Have you any thoughts or reflections? I think it's on.
Okay. So my question kind of jumps from what you just taught us and jumps ahead. I hope that's okay.
Sure.
So I had once heard a Bible teacher kind of break down like similar information on the Nephilim, but he kind of brought it to another place, talking about like when God told the Israelites to go into these places and just like clear out the people, which was always really hard for anyone to imagine, like children, innocent people. And obviously the Bible doesn't dive into all of the reasons, but I had heard once that they were from Nephilim descent, and that kind of made sense in my brain, like, okay, they're messing with the line that Jesus is going to come through. But now that we go through this, I'm thinking, well, didn't the flood already happen? So now I'm just kind of confused on that whole timeline.
Yeah, so much there. First of all, yes, you have identified something that is going to come up later, is that there will be a flood that will come through Canaan to wipe away hybrid beings. And others get caught up in it, no question, but not all of them. Not all of them get wiped out. And that flood, in this case, is the Israelites. But, yeah, so what are they doing there? Because didn't we just have a flood that... Notice that the biblical authors are already aware of this issue because they said, I think it's in verse 1 or 2, we've already read, that they were there in that time and also afterward, it says. So they're acknowledging that this isn't the only, already in Genesis chapter 6, the first time these are mentioned, the biblical authors are acknowledging this is not the only time the Nephilim will show up. They come also afterwards. And afterwards doesn't mean like in the next few verses, it's after the flood. So how do they show up after the flood? People argue about these things. Welcome to a huge area of debate. There's several options. But the ambiguity in the scripture draws our attention to it. This is one of the techniques that the biblical authors use, is to leave certain things ambiguous, so we'll keep going back to it. Maybe, it's driving me crazy. I got to know the answer. And they don't give it. And part of the reason they don't give it is so we'll keep going back to the text, because it's important.
One of the things that I look at it is they acted as rulers over both realms.
Yes, or they wanted to. That's what
they
it appears
wanted to.
Right.
But don't we see people trying to do that right now?
Yep.
And when you look at this, and you have encountered young people that are totally possessed, and we've prayed over them, and these people have answered back. So they try and penetrate even now, as it were.
Yes. So, all right. So there is, I'm not ready to get into this tonight, but it gets even weirder than we just discussed tonight. Unclean spirits in the New Testament are generally given the blame for inhabiting people and possessing them. And unclean spirits in the biblical mindset, the New Testament mindset, are connected to these Nephilim. That's all I'm going to say. So it's very weird, but they are connected.
So the snake swaps skins.
The snake skins are being worn by different beings, yeah. That was deep.
I've really enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah, you can.
I just find myself in a situation that, and I'm sure all of us are in this kind of situation, that we almost gobsmacked of the heavenly realm and the fight that there was in the heavenly realm and how it has fallen into our place.
Yeah.
And we see it because we've seen people so awful in the world. So the battle carries on. And he says very clearly that we don't battle against flesh and blood.
Yes.
And to me, you seem to, or I have sometimes just wiped this as something that is said. But the more we go into this, the more I realize that the battle is still on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a spiritual battle. It is.
But we win. I mean, Lord wins.
The Lord wins it. Amen. Anything else? I feel like you have something, Scott. All right. Okay. So we do have a few moments for questions, and are we set up for questions? All right. Beautiful. I can't imagine anybody has any questions tonight.
No, not at all. No one's confused. So you alluded to the fact that in 120 years the flood would wipe out the Nephilim.
Yeah.
But now you're sounding like they kind of make a comeback.
That sounded like what?
Like they make a comeback post-flood.
Oh, so 120 years, this flood is coming to wipe things out. But the biblical author, as we've already read, says that these Nephilim are not just here in this time, but it's also afterwards. So, yeah, verse 4. The Nephilim were in the Edites in those days, pre-flood, and also afterward. So we know that this isn't the end of the Nephilim. Now, whether they survived the flood, whether the flood was global or not quite global, whether the corruption happened at a future time, or the spirits inhabited other, this is what people argue about. So, and the Bible is not entirely clear, because we get to still think about it.
What prevents the forbidden barrier from happening again throughout history between spiritual beings mating with humans?
Yeah, good question. So, the way I like to think of it is that it happened once, it'll never happen again, we're good. That's just my preference. I don't know that if I can back that up scripturally.
Was Goliath one of these ancient heroes?
Well, hello.
You knew a Goliath one was coming.
Goliath or Goliath is certainly framed as this mighty Gibborim champion. It's not the only one. It's not there's we've noted already in the book of Joshua, these beings are talked about. But Goliath is definitely presented that way. Goliath. Read the story. If you can read it in interlinear, we've got the Hebrew and the English, and just like look up the Hebrew words. He is presented as wearing this type of armor that is bronze, which is the same words, the same letters in Hebrew for bronze are the words of Nachash. They're just reordered. And they're like scales. So, hello. David is confronting the Nachash in that story. Yeah, it's pretty wild, isn't it? I mean, there's just no question. And it's not the only time. There's another one with Saul who goes up early on, before he's actually accepted as king by everybody, but after his anointing, he confronts a dude, look it up, whose name is Nahash. Nahash. So, yeah, these people that God anoints and raises up are constantly facing these Nahash. They're wearing the rubber Godzilla suit. They're not Satan, but there's different characters that wear that snakeskin. I'm sorry, that was free. No charge for that.
Sorry, I had it right here. 1 second. Does this mean that there isn't a limit on our lives anymore?
Oh, I don't think the Bible addresses if he's talking about the 120 years being the time from he said that to the time the flood starts. That's what I think the biblical authors are trying to convey here, not how long a person is going to live. But they're conveying that from the time that this God is like, that's it. You know, these creatures are corrupt, humans are corrupt, so I'm giving them 120 years. And it's 120 years from this moment till the flood starts. That doesn't say anything one way or another on how long humans get to live. If it was, then this is how long that humans are going to live from now on. I don't think that makes sense, because there's many humans in the scriptures themselves after this that live beyond 120 years. Does that make sense? So that's all the questions. You guys are great. You get to get out early today. Isn't that exciting? So I want to encourage you, next week we are going to spend an hour looking at preparing ourselves for the Mabul, for the flood. We're going to look at why this flood is such a big deal, what it would have meant to the ancients. Before we get into the actual narrative of the flood itself, I think we just got to prepare ourselves to look at it through the proper lenses. And this is obviously, it's taking up over 3 chapters of the Bible, and there's not too many chapters that we've gone through so far. So it's an extremely important event. Narratively, it's extremely important to the biblical authors. It's extremely important to God. And so we're going to, leave behind the children's books on the flood. We're going to embrace some of the tensions and difficulties in the flood, and we're going to look at it from the standpoint of the biblical narrative, and we'll try to set aside our desire to know exactly what happened and where's the scientific evidence for it. There's plenty of material for you to read on that, and it's wonderful, but we're going to look at how it affects the unfolding of the Bible and how it affects how we read the rest of the Bible. So you guys are great. It was a great class. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pastor Tim. All right, so men, as you know, you will be meeting tonight in the chapel. Ladies, you can stay here for Women's Night. But I'm just going to pray us out before I dismiss us, okay? Dear God, thank you so much for Pastor Tim, for giving us such a wonderful teacher, God. Thank you for your word, and just for working out all the intricate details, God, that make up this grand story of salvation and redemption, Lord. Would you protect us? Would you keep us safe tonight, Lord? And just keep us safe and ready to come back home next week, Lord. In your name I pray. Amen. Thank you.